They said the cowboy on Deadwind Ridge hadn't spoken a word in 10 years. But the night a nameless woman stumbled out of the dark with a baby in her arms, bleeding, starving, and begging for silence more than help, something in that long-buried voice began to stir again, though no one, not her, not the child, not even the man himself, could have known that the past she was running from would soon ride straight to his door, forcing him to choose between the quiet he had built to survive and the violence he had once sworn never to return to. The wind that night came down off the ridge like it had teeth, gnawing at the edges of the world, rattling the loose boards of the small, stubborn cabin that stood alone against the endless stretch of dry grass and stone. And inside that cabin the man moved in the same slow, deliberate rhythm he had followed for years, stacking wood, checking his rifle, keeping the fire low and controlled, as if even flames had to be disciplined in a place like this. Because out here everything either learned to obey or it died. And he had chosen obedience long ago, chosen silence most of all, burying his words somewhere deep enough that even memory couldn't easily reach them, until the knock came. Or rather, the sound that almost wasn't a knock at all, just a dull, uneven thud against the door, like something, or someone, too weak to ask properly. He didn't react at first, only paused, this hand hovering over the edge of the table, listening the way a man listens who has survived by noticing what others ignore. And when the sound came again, softer this time, followed by the faintest cry, thin, fragile, not quite human in its desperation, he turned, slow and cautious, crossing the room with the quiet weight of someone who trusted nothing beyond what he could see. And when he opened the door, the wind pushed in first, cold and sharp, carrying dust and the smell of coming rain. And then he saw her, crumpled at the threshold like she had been dropped, there by the sky itself, her clothes torn and stiff with dirt, her bare feet raw and bleeding, her dark hair tangled across a face too pale to belong to the living, and clutched against her chest, wrapped in what little cloth she had left, was a baby, too small, too still, until it let out that same broken cry, and the sound cut through the night, through the wind, through him, sharper than anything he had felt in years. She tried to lift her head, tried to speak, but whatever strength had carried her this far was gone, and the only thing that made it past her cracked lips was a whisper, so faint it barely existed. "Don't let him find us," before her body gave out completely, folding into the dirt at his feet. And for a long moment he just stood there, looking down at them, the wind tugging at his coat, the door creaking in its hinges, the world holding its breath around a choice that should have been simple. Leave them, close the door, return to the life he had carved out of isolation and quiet. But nothing about the sound of that child was simple. Nothing about the way its tiny fingers clung blindly to the fabric at her chest, as if it knew the difference between being held and being lost. And before he could stop himself, before he could think it through the way he used to think everything through, he moved, bending down, lifting them both with a strength that came as naturally as breathing. The woman light as a bundle of dry sticks, the baby warm against the cold night air, and he carried them inside, kicking the door shut behind him with a dull thud that seemed louder than it should have been, like the closing of something he didn't yet understand. He laid her on the narrow bed in the corner, the same bed he had used for years without thought, and for a second he hesitated, his hands hovering awkwardly as if unsure what came next, because it had been a long time since he had tended to anyone but himself, a long time since another heartbeat had existed in his space, and yet he found himself moving anyway, pulling an extra blanket from the shelf, wrapping it around her shoulders, adjusting the small bundle in her arms until he could see the baby's face, pale, drawn, but alive. And when it let out a weak, restless whimper, he did something he hadn't done in longer than he cared to remember. He reached out and touched it, just a brief brush of his rough fingers against its cheek, as if testing whether it was real, and the baby stilled, just for a moment, as if recognizing something steady in the world, something that didn't shift or threaten or disappear. And that moment, small, almost nothing, settled somewhere deep inside him in a way that made him turn away quickly, as if he had seen too much. The night dragged on, the storm breaking outside in bursts of wind and scattered rain, and inside the cabin the fire burned low but constant, casting long shadows across the walls as the man moved through his routine with something new threading through it, something unsettled, checking on her more often than he meant to, glancing at the child each time it stirred, listening not just for danger beyond the walls but for the fragile rhythm of breathing within them. And when morning finally came, pale and thin through the cracks in the wood, the world outside looked unchanged, empty, harsh, unforgiving. But inside, something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone, because there were now 3 lives under that roof instead of 1, and even in silence, even without a single word spoken, that changed everything. Morning came slow and gray over Deadwind Ridge, the kind of light that didn't so much rise as seep into the world, and inside the cabin the quiet had changed, not broken, not filled with words, but stretched thinner, like something fragile now lived within it. The woman woke with a sharp breath, her body jerking upright before the pain caught up to her, every muscle protesting, her throat dry as dust. And for a moment she didn't know where she was, only that she was alive when she hadn't expected to be. And then she remembered the door, the wind, the last of her strength slipping away, and her hands flew to her chest in panic until she saw the baby, lying close beside her, wrapped tighter now in a clean strip of cloth, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. And the relief hit her so hard it almost knocked her back down again. She gathered him close, pressing her face into his hair, breathing him in like proof that the world hadn't taken everything, and only then did she notice the man, sitting across the room near the fire, his broad frame still as stone, watching without staring, present without intruding. And she froze for a second under that gaze, fear flickering through her before she forced it down, because if he meant harm, it would have come already. And something about the way the cabin was kept, clean, ordered, deliberate, told her he wasn't careless. And men who weren't careless didn't usually waste effort on cruelty without reason. "Thank you," she said, her voice rough and uncertain, the words feeling too loud in a place that seemed built around silence. But he didn't answer, didn't nod, didn't even shift except for the smallest movement of his hand as he set another piece of wood into the fire. And that was when she understood what the stories must have meant, what little she had heard before choosing this place over anywhere else. That he didn't speak, not couldn't, but wouldn't, like the act itself had been locked away somewhere, unreachable, and for reasons she didn't yet know, that made her feel safer than anything else could have. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them acknowledged, but both understood. He left at first light, returning hours later with whatever the land allowed. Rabbit, sometimes nothing, sometimes more, and each time there was food left for her without a word, water drawn fresh. The fire tended just enough that it never died, and she, in turn, made herself useful in the only ways she could, sweeping the floor, mending what she found torn, keeping the space alive in small quiet ways that didn't demand attention but left traces of care behind. And though they never spoke, a strange understanding formed between them, built not on trust exactly, but on the absence of threat, which in her world was often the same thing. The baby became the center of it all, the only sound that filled the cabin freely, his soft cries, his restless movements, the occasional small laugh that seemed almost out of place in such a hard, silent place. And the cowboy began to linger more when he was inside, his movements slowing, his attention drawn again and again to the child in ways he didn't seem to realize, until one evening, she found him sitting at the table with a piece of wood and a knife, carving something small and uneven, his large hands moving with a care that didn't match their size. And when he finished, he set it near the baby without looking at her, a rough little shape that might have been a horse if you looked at it long enough. And she understood then that whatever had broken his voice hadn't taken everything. It was on the 6th day that things began to unravel, slow at first, easy to miss, the baby growing quieter than usual, his cries weaker, his body too warm against her skin, and by nightfall the heat had turned into something frightening, his tiny frame burning with fever, his breathing uneven, and panic took hold of her in a way she couldn't control, sharp and consuming, because out here there was no doctor, no help, nothing but the man across the room and the wilderness beyond the walls. And she tried to stay steady, tried to remember the fragments of knowledge she carried. Cool water, steady warmth, patience. But fear made everything blur, and for the first time since she had arrived, she looked at him not as a shelter, but as a last hope. He saw it. She knew he did. The way her movements grew frantic, the way her voice broke even when she tried to keep it quiet, and he stood there for a long moment, unmoving, something heavy passing behind his eyes, something that looked dangerously close to memory, and then, without a word, he turned and left, the door slamming harder than it ever had before, the sound echoing through the cabin like a crack in the world itself. She thought he had abandoned them, and the thought nearly broke her, but there was no time for it. Only the child in her arms, only the rising heat, only the desperate need to keep him alive. And so she fought through the night alone, dipping cloth in water, whispering soft, broken comforts, holding him close even as fear clawed at her chest, until the door burst open again just before dawn, and the cowboy stumbled back inside, his coat soaked through, his face pale from cold and exhaustion, something clutched tightly in his hand. Herbs, medicine, whatever he had managed to find or take, and he dropped them onto the table with a force that spoke louder than any words could have, moving quickly now, urgently, as if whatever silence he lived in had been pushed aside by something stronger, something older, and together, without speaking, they worked to bring the fever down, hour by hour, breath by breath, until at last the child's body cooled, the tension leaving him in a slow, fragile release. And when it was over, when the danger had passed, and the first light of true morning touched the edges of the room, she sank back in exhaustion, tears slipping free without restraint, and across from her, the cowboy stood still, watching, his chest rising heavier than before, his jaw tight, and for just a second, it looked like he might say something, like the words were there, pressing against whatever wall he had built, but they didn't come, not yet, and instead the silence returned, softer now, changed in a way neither of them could ignore, because outside, somewhere beyond the ridge, faint but unmistakable, came the distant sound of horses. The sound of horses didn't belong on Deadwind Ridge, not this high, not this far from any road that mattered, and the moment it reached the cabin it settled into the bones of the place like a warning that couldn't be ignored. The woman going still where she sat, the baby cradled tight against her chest, as if she could hide him inside her own heartbeat, while across the room the cowboy turned his head slightly toward the door, listening in that same sharp, measured way he did everything. But this time there was something else beneath it, recognition, maybe, or the quiet certainty that whatever peace had taken root here was about to be torn out. The horses came closer, slow and deliberate, not lost travelers, not wandering drifters, but men who knew exactly where they were going. And when the first shadow crossed the narrow window slit, the woman's breath hitched, her fingers tightening instinctively around the child, because she didn't need to see to know who it was. Some fears don't need proof. They live in you long before they arrive. And when the door handle rattled hard, once, then again, she whispered under her breath, "No, no, no, no," as if denial alone could hold the world back. The door burst open without waiting for an answer, slamming against the wall with a crack that shattered whatever quiet remained, and the man who stepped inside carried the smell of dust, sweat, and ownership, his eyes locking onto her with a kind of satisfaction that made her stomach turn. "Found you," he said, voice low and pleased, like he had just tracked down something that belonged to him. And behind him stood another man, rifle already in hand, watching the room with cold, practiced caution, and for a second everything hung there, the past and the present colliding in a space too small to hold them both. The cowboy didn't move at first, didn't speak, just stood between them and the woman, his body a wall built without effort, and the man laughed when he noticed him. A short, mocking sound. "So this is where you ran," he said, stepping further inside, eyes flicking over the cabin with open disdain, hiding with a ghost. His gaze returned to the cowboy, lingering there with cruel amusement. "They said you didn't talk. Didn't believe it myself," he added, circling slightly, testing the space like a predator. "But I guess some men are just born useless." The insult hung in the air, but the cowboy didn't react, not outwardly, though something in his posture shifted, subtle, dangerous, like a line had been drawn where none existed before. "Hand her over," the man continued, his voice hardening. "And the kid, I'm taking what's mine and leaving this dump standing. You get in the way." He let the threat trail off, his hand resting easy on the butt of his gun, the meaning clear without words, and behind him the hired man adjusted his grip on the rifle, lifting it just enough to make the choice visible. The woman stepped forward then, her legs shaking but moving anyway, because she understood something the cowboy didn't yet. Men like this didn't stop, didn't bargain, didn't forget, and if she stayed behind that silent wall, blood would follow. "I'll go," she said quickly, her voice breaking but steady enough to carry. "Just don't hurt him." Her eyes flicked toward the cowboy, just for a second, something like apology passing through them, something like gratitude too, but she didn't wait for a response, didn't dare. She just moved, each step heavier than the last, until the man's hand closed around her arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Smart girl," he muttered, satisfaction curling through his tone as he reached for the baby. And that was the moment everything broke. The cowboy moved. Not fast, not wild, but certain, stepping forward with a weight that changed the air in the room. And for the first time, the man hesitated, just enough to notice that this wasn't the same kind of silence he had mocked. This wasn't emptiness. It was pressure, held back for too long. "Stay out of it," the hired man snapped, raising the rifle fully now, aiming straight at the cowboy's chest, and the world narrowed down to that single line between them. The woman caught in the middle, the baby starting to cry, sharp and desperate, the sound cutting deeper than any thread. And something inside the cowboy, something buried under years of quiet and distance, finally gave way. He remembered without wanting to, the weight of another child in his arms, the heat of fever, the stillness that came after, the silence that followed him into every corner of this place. And suddenly it wasn't just this moment in front of him. It was all of it, past and present tangled together in a way he couldn't separate. And he knew, with a clarity that didn't need words, that if he stepped back now, if he let them take her, take the child, he would lose everything again, not just them, but whatever piece of himself had started to come back to life in this cabin. The man tightened his grip on the baby, pulling him free from her arms despite her struggle, and the child's cry turned into a full, terrified wail, echoing through the room. And that was it. That was the line he couldn't let be crossed. The cowboy lunged, faster than either of them expected, his hand striking the rifle aside just as it fired, the shot exploding into the wall behind him, splintering wood and filling the air with smoke and shock. And then the space collapsed into motion, fists and force and raw instinct, the hired man going down hard, the gun skidding across the floor, the other man shouting, reaching, trying to regain control. But the cowboy didn't stop, didn't hesitate, every movement driven by something deeper than thought, something that had been waiting 10 years to be unleashed. It ended as quickly as it began, the kind of violence that leaves no room for doubt. And when it was over, the cabin fell back into silence again, heavy, ringing, broken only by the baby's fading cries and the woman's uneven breathing as she pulled him back into her arms, holding him like she would never let go again. The cowboy stood in the middle of it all, chest rising and falling, hands still, the storm inside him slowly settling. And for a long moment, no one spoke, because for him, that had always been the way. But now the silence felt different, thinner, like something had cracked open and couldn't be sealed again. And when she finally looked at him, really looked, not with fear or caution, but with something else, something steady. He felt the words rise up, rough and unfamiliar, pushing against the place he had locked them away. And this time, they didn't stop. His voice came out low, broken from disuse, but unmistakably real. "You stay," he said, each word heavy, uneven, but carrying more weight than anything else in that room. And the sound of it seemed to settle something between them, something that had been waiting since the moment she fell at his door, because the silence he had lived in for so long was no longer the only thing he had left. And out on Deadwind Ridge, where nothing was supposed to last, something had finally begun.